He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with over 26 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love to talk about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Today, Henry, we have a guest who really loves to talk about briefs, maybe as much, maybe even more than we do. His name is Tim Brunelle. He's in the city of Minneapolis. He is a copywriter, creative director, strategist. Let's let him tell us a little bit more about Tim. All right, Henry, we're back with another episode. Today we have someone special back from Minneapolis, one of my favorite cities. We do seem to tap in a lot to Minneapolis for talent, for guests. This gentleman with us today is named Tim Brunelle. I came to know about Tim through our friend, Mark Jenson, who is a designated substitute host when either Henry or I can't be around. But he also is a lecturer at the University of Minnesota. So Mark said, here's a link to Tim Brunelle. He's a guest on a podcast. Listen, and he might be a potential guest. Now, I'm going to have a little confession to make here before I turn this over and ask you to introduce yourself, Tim.
Yeah.
I kind of shared a little bit with Henry. I was listening to your comments, and I was thinking, man, this guy knows his shit. He's talking about creative briefs. It's like I'm starting to think, damn, he knows more than I do. I got to get this guy on here. And so I thought I'll reach out to him because, Mark recommended him. I reached out to him and said, hey, we'd love to have you on our show. We talk about briefs. And he writes back and he says, yeah, I'd love to come on your show. And I'm looking at a copy of your book, How to Write an Inspired Creative Brief. And I thought, damn, I'm embarrassed for feeling like this he knows too much. But I realized that you're a fellow traveler. We love to talk about briefs. So Tim, welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. And I got a bunch of questions. I'm sure Henry does. We haven't had someone on that has written and talked as much about the briefs as you have. It's like almost as much as we do. So welcome, Tim. Tell us about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me. And Howard, I have what is this, issue 1, version 1?
Yeah, edition 1.
Issue 1. I think I gave you $14 for it. Or I gave it to Jeff Bezos and he gave you a few pennies.
Yeah.
But it's funny, right? I'm a writer by trade, copywriter by trade.
Me too.
Got into the advertising industry. I got a degree in music and jazz and realized I loved playing. I'm a drummer, but it's not going to pay the bills. And family friends were working at advertising agencies in Minneapolis, and I started to just talk to those folks and realized, oh, that's an industry that would take someone like me. Like, you didn't need to have a degree in advertising to be welcomed into advertising. Unlike, say, medicine. It helps if you've studied medicine to practice it, but certainly not advertising. And
or marketing.
Right. And so, this is 91, 92. I'm in Minneapolis, and I'm, very fortunate, sort of pre-internet. I'm literally writing letters, handwritten letters to legendary people at Carmichael and Fallon and Martin Williams and other places, asking, like, can I please come talk to you? I'm interested in this world of advertising, right? So pre-internet, pre-email, and everyone was very kind. I still have it somewhere. I have this list of all of the interviews that I went on. I would write down a little spreadsheet of a date, where we met, what we talked about. And that I probably did about 60 interviews over the course of a year and a half, just kind of finding people and discovering what is a portfolio. Apparently you need one, and kind of learning what that thing is, and kind of getting a sense of, well, what constitutes great copywriting and great art direction, and how do you have your own kind of standards in that space? Kind of the best tip I got that I still recommend to folks is go pick up 4 or 5 years of The One Show or ComArts, or you can go online now, obviously, but consider that those are sort of curated collections of great advertising, what the industry considers to be great advertising. Fantastic. Good. Now you go and you curate your top 10, top 20 from the things that you find. So take 5 years of ComArts annuals and put Post-it notes on your favorite ads so that you're creating your own sort of level. And then go back and look at them and kind of ask yourself, why am I liking these 10? What's common across these 10? And I noticed for me, of course, they were all headline driven. They, very few of them were visual solutions kind of ads. And a lot of them had Minneapolis writers in them. And so that gave me a chance to kind of say hello to people and say, I really loved the ad that you wrote. Hey, Jim Nelson, I love this man on an airplane opening a bag of peanuts headline that you wrote for Harley. Could I meet with you? Well, I just praised the guy. Of course he's going to say yes, so we have a cup of coffee. So yeah, I got to know the business and, interned at Martin Williams and then interned out in New York. And then turns out an account guy I had met during my travels had moved to St. Louis. They were hiring. I got a job at TBWA in St. Louis and was there for a bit, then moved to Boston. So it became
Where'd you work at Boston?
I moved to Boston to work for Bill Heater and Don Easton, who had been at Hill Holiday and then started their own shop. They were the guys that brought us the Infinity ads that were there were no cars in them. The Rocks and Trees campaign, that was kind of
I'm a Hill Holiday alumnus. That's why I asked.
So you know Kelly Fredrickson and all those folks.
So I was there from 2003 through 2007, but they had an office down here in Fort Lauderdale, and we moved it to Miami Beach, and we established a small Hispanic practice, and we launched CVS Pharmacy, which was a Hill Holiday account.
Yeah,
we launched them into Florida, Texas, and California's Hispanic markets as CVS began acquiring different pharmacy chains.
Did you work with Lance Jensen?
No. The big boss back then was Mike Sheehan.
Mm-hmm. The great Mike Sheehan, wonderful human being. So Boston, and then I worked on the VW business, and the internet arrives, right? And all of a sudden, you're not just trying to solve problems with words and images. Now you have interaction. You're creating these experiences, and all of that kind of influenced kind of the way that I think about creativity. But we were talking earlier. So websites were this thing. HTML was a language that you could learn to create websites. And I built my first website back in '94, and then I built another one. I was at this agency with Bill Heater Easton, and we had this idea that we would write each other emails late at night after we'd had a few, and that these emails would then become posted on our website. We didn't know blogging didn't really exist, but this was this early idea of blogging. And I'm sure if I looked them up on the Internet Archive, they would be wonderfully embarrassing. But so I got into writing about stuff, and a lot of that early writing was kind of in reaction to the experiences that we were having, and a lot of the experiences that you have as a creative person is you get handed a terrible brief, and so then when blogging really took off in, 07, 08, that was a thing that I just kind of always would fall back and write on. If in fact, I had a friend of mine, Jeff Graham, who works out in Denver, has a great shop there. We used to trade briefs back and forth because he was teaching at the University of Colorado and I was lecturing. And so it'd be like, hey, I'll share my collection of briefs. You share me yours. And so it's a thing that we as creative people are often subjected to, right? We're handed a brief, and that's kind of been my focus. It's always been, I'm the recipient. Until I owned my own agency, I was rarely involved in writing a brief. I might give some feedback to a planner or a strategist, but 9 times out of 10, the brief was being handed to me as a creative person with the onus of now please go off and find an idea that changes the world, And that's really the gist of it, right? When you think about what is this document that is carefully crafted, hopefully, by these individuals, and then there's this weird handoff, right, which is its own political dramatic moment of the brief being handed off, and then you or I, it's like as I say, the metaphor is you go into the fog, come up with something completely new, but that's also somewhat kind of familiar, right? That kind of rides that edge. And the idea that you come up with should advance the business interests of our client, but also be just utterly remarkable on a creative level. So, I mean, that's like,
in other words, a home run.
Yeah, do a magic trick. And the thing that you're being handed to help you do the magic trick above and beyond your own skill and your wits and your partner is the brief. And no wonder I think that we get upset when we get handed an incomplete or lame or uninspired brief. Mm-hmm. Because the expectation is that we're going to go solve the world, right? We're going to come up with a legendary campaign. And if you're off on that adventure and the little backpack of supplies that you've been handed is empty, right? It's an empty brief. You're going to have a hard time coming up with something great. So I've always written about creative briefing from the perspective of receiving it and with the expectation that you're supposed to do something.
What are some of the main reasons you think that bad briefs are bad? In other words, where does it go off the rails?
Well, it goes off the rails in a bunch of different places. I think there's a misunderstanding about what a creative brief is. That's one way that it goes off the rails, in that the account team or the strategy team is under the impression that the creative brief is actually a client-facing document, and that it's really about a contract, and that they're using it as a mechanism to get agreement with a client about what the creative people ought to do. That's just wrong. You know, I mean, that's a strategy document for the client.
A man after my own heart.
So that's one way.
So you probably wouldn't know this, but the genesis of this video podcast that you are now participating in was that I was on vacation with my son, and I've had a relationship with Howard like more than 10 years. I too had bought Howard's book, and I brought Howard to the agency I was at the time, and he taught a workshop, and on and off we had been communicating. And one day he texted me and said, "Oh, look at this paper that the ANA has sent out about, this collaborative brief between client and agencies." And I said, "Howard, that's fantastic in theory, but in practice, it just doesn't work." And so we had this back and forth debate. And I said, "You know what? We should do this, but do it for a podcast and talk about creative briefs." And so that was the genesis. That's why I laughed when you said,
and I used to defend that position. It's a 17-page white paper, and there's a lot of other great stuff in it besides that particular. There's a paragraph or two about this topic,
right?
But there was at the time some validity to the idea of what. In other words, it's right now the world is two briefs. We get something from the client,
right?
Whether it's a phone call or a 37-page document or something in between,
right?
And then
usually a 100-slide deck is usually
right. And
here's what McKinsey gave us.
Yeah, and then there's the response that the agency makes, and the question is there a better process? Now, the ANA, and I work for the ANA's Marketing Training and Development Center. I do workshops. I'm one of about 80 instructors. The ANA offers 140, 150 different workshops on every imaginable topic.
Yeah.
And I do a whole series of workshops on brief writing.
Right.
So they have a task force called the Creative Brief Task Force. And it's populated by a lot of clients and a lot of creatives, some senior level creatives. And in their wisdom, they got together and said, we should have one brief. The client and the creatives, or the client and the agency, should sit down together and craft out a brief. And you know what? Bob Hoffman basically says the same thing. I don't know if you're familiar with Bob.
Yeah, Bob. Yep.
Bob Hoffman says the brief should be written by two people, the CMO and the CCO. And it should be 3 words: make me famous.
Right. Yeah. He's not
Well,
wrong.
I've got a problem with that, but that's another story. I've told Henry over the months we've been doing this podcast. We're now, this is our 84th or 85th episode. We've done it every week for 85 weeks. I have changed.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we're pretty cool. We're pretty happy with that. I have admitted on the air, such as it is,
Right.
that Henry was right and I was wrong. I no longer subscribe.
But I have to keep rubbing it in. Otherwise, what fun is it?
Yeah, and that's okay. And I'll just.
That's part of what makes the two of you entertaining.
Like I said, I think that it's an admirable goal. And I think that you can co-create a creative or co-write a creative brief with a client, with the right client, with a client that understands what the brief is for. But in the real world, you have clients that basically they parse every word. They're trying to already forecast what the creative is going to be like based on the brief. And so that causes them, like, anything that's audacious in the brief, they're like, freaking out on.
Right.
So to me, it just introduces a whole bunch of steps that I'd rather avoid. I'd rather receive the client's brief, understand it, ask questions, poke holes in it if I have to, and then sit down and say, reduce that to what my creatives need to know to do the job right. And then when we go to present, there'll be some sort of strategy set up where some elements of my brief will be there to basically, give some runway for the ideas that are about to be presented, and avoid all of that back and forth negotiation. The creative brief shouldn't be a negotiated document with the client. I don't see it. And I see it as the first step of the creative process, not the last step of the order taking process.
Right. But Tim, hang on. I'm going to challenge you on something that you said earlier, because you said that you were frustrated when you were handed this document and expected to solve the problems of the world. I contend, and this is an amendment to or an addendum to the idea of collaboration. You should never be given a brief at the briefing. Henry prides himself on working with his creatives before the briefing. He shows his creatives drafts to get their take on it. So are you saying to me that you have received briefs in the past without, just like, here it is, go do your thing? It's the first time you've seen it?
Oh yeah. I mean,
that to me is wrong. That to me is bad.
Yeah. In the, 25 years in advertising, hundreds of briefs, certainly there were circumstances where you were aware that a project was coming. You were aware, you knew the client because you'd been working on it, and you knew what the project was because you'd heard about it on the schedules and things like that. So you already had a pretty good background on like, we kind of know what's going to happen. And we know the people that we're working with, and, project 17 of 29, like we're at project 11. So you're aware of it. So when it comes in that sense, you've already got a lot of the background there, and you may not have seen the final thing, or as the writer, I might not have seen it, but my boss, the creative director, might have seen it.
Right.
But here's the thing, to kind of bolster Henry's point. Who is the creative brief written for? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is it's written for the client, then great. We don't need creative people, and the clients can go make the ads. Right? I mean, we laugh, but come on, right? So there is a document, and I think Julian Cole makes the argument too. There is a strategic framework document, call it that you can workshop with clients. It's about making sure that we're focused in the right areas. We're focused on the right attributes, the right insights, etc. And that, call it a strategic document that the clients can hem and haw over and ask questions, but it's not called a creative document because they're not being expected to do anything with it, right? If it's a creative brief, the expectation is you're giving it to writers and art directors and designers, creative people, to do something, right? And I argue it does two things. It informs them, like, remember, it's for this client and not another client. It's for a specific product. It's for a specific audience, like all the typical mandatories. But the second point is that it should inflame them, meaning I should pick up this brief and go like, oh, yes. Oh, I know we can do great work. I know I can go change the world. And that little bit rarely happens.
Yeah.
And to the question you asked earlier, why? Well, in part because people think I'm writing a creative brief to not piss off a client. Well, that's not going to inflame anybody, or it's going to make a client upset. It's not going to help the creative people. The second reason, the most important reason why briefs fail is because they're just not taken seriously, that they are treated as a formula to be filled out by the least expensive person in the room.
At the last minute,
and some lowly account person. And I'd argue the most expensive, smartest person in the agency should be writing the briefs. Because in theory, they're the smartest person. In theory, they can get us to the best insights.
Right.
But that
so those were the two in my mind when I asked you the question, like,
Yeah.
why are so many briefs bad? And one is because the personnel that are writing it are inexperienced and
Right.
are filling out a form instead of giving deep thought to these important questions to put them down so that somebody can act upon it. And
it's not treated seriously.
And the second is because too much of it is negotiated with clients to get a client approval that takes rounds any edges off of it. I also, as a brief writer, I think my goal, if I can write a super inspiring creative brief, that to me is a home run.
Yeah.
But the bare minimum that I can do is write a clear brief that lets the creatives know where they stand and where they should be going.
Right.
And so many briefs fail to meet even that minimum standard. Like, sometimes I'll look back and say, well, this wasn't my best effort, but I know that I didn't leave them confused.
Right.
I know that there's no ambiguity to what we have to do. So in that sense, at least it's better than, like the replacement level strategist would have written, but yeah, I mean, you're always looking for that, killer insight or that one line that's memorable that they're going to say, oh shit, yeah, that's so true. Or that's exactly how I feel about this subject or whatever.
And that's hard work. And let's be very clear. The reason there aren't that many awesome creative briefs is because they're really hard to do. There's the same reason there's not when you look at the award shows and you look at great advertising that comes out, the memorable stuff was hard to do. The brief was hard to do. So it's not an easy task, and the challenge is that the industry, because of the requirements of campaigns and things like that, probably tens of thousands of briefs are written in the United States, never mind the world, every year. So the likelihood, like songwriting or movie making or episode television, right? Like the likelihood that every single brief is going to be amazing is non-existent. So the trick is, can we increase the small percentage of good briefs and the great briefs, right? Can we just make a few more slightly better?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like baseball, like the batting averages are not what you'd expect. Like a great baseball player gets 3 hits out of 10 at bats.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Or even, a golfer. How many times does a golfer actually win a tournament? Although these days you can become a millionaire and never win a tournament because there's so much money out there.
Right.
But I love, and I'm going to steal your use of the word inflame. I use the word inspire.
Yeah.
Inflame is actually more, sorry for the pun, more incendiary. It's about getting the creatives really excited. I've had a couple of posts on LinkedIn recently about how do you know when your brief is actually good? And one of my arguments is, there are a lot of ways to define that. One of my arguments is creatives have terrible poker faces.
Yeah.
You want to make a lot of money off of a creative, invite them to a poker game, because you can read what when we get excited about something, we show our feelings.
Yeah.
So a good brief provokes a response the way an ad is supposed to provoke a response. Or great art is supposed to provoke a response.
Right.
If your brief is good, the creatives are going to say, yeah, like what you just said, I can work with this. Or they'll start ideating right in front of you.
Right.
If the brief is mediocre, they're going to say, and I've heard creatives say this, they'll listen to the briefing, they'll read the brief, and they'll say, okay, so what is it you want me to do?
Right. Yeah. Or they're like, yeah, because they have so much other work to do. And then basically you just gave them a nothing burger. So, look, I got
they're
got
going to
other
start
things
from
that are
zero, basically.
right.
Right.
Thanks.
Or they'll go,
Thanks for
or they'll
nothing.
go and they'll write their own brief. I mean, I've never done that, but I've heard plenty of stories where creatives will say, I think I know what they're trying to tell me. They didn't really say that. I'm going to go and write my own. I'm not going to tell them that I rewrote the brief. You know, Cameron Day was on our show a while ago, and he said, I always take the brief and rewrite it, and I call it a mantra.
Yeah.
And then I share that mantra with the client, and they say, wow, that's better than our brief.
Well,
So-
he's correct in the same way that an actor, if you hand a screenplay to an actor, what a lot of actors do, they'll first with a black marker, they'll go straight cross out all the stage direction, right? Don't tell me that I'm angry when I open the door, or that I'm, whatever, like just give me the words, right? And so in the same way, I've rewritten briefs. I've had teams rewrite briefs. And my argument or my support of that is any port in a storm. Like whatever's going to help you do amazing work as a creative person, you should go do that, because it's just a bunch of words on a piece of paper. You're not going to hurt anyone's feelings.
Well,
so,
one of my mantras, and Howard's probably tired of it, is that the good strategist should be open to amending as we, I've had occasions, where they bring work that isn't strictly to the brief, but it brings something more insightful than that I hadn't thought of. And you have to be open to say, you know what, that's even better.
Right.
And then, I've had occasions where I've rebriefed based on an idea that one of the creatives brought a new insight to the table, a new way of looking at the problem.
Right.
And then that just a whole nother round of creative ideation that we would have never gotten to if I had just crossed my arms and said, that's not in the brief.
Right. Well, think of it this way. Is the storyboard, you go to the trouble of building a storyboard, is that the commercial? Of course not. It's a story. It's a disposable document that's meant to get you approval to get on set to shoot something, to go at blah, blah, etc. The same with the brief. If the brief, and I've had this happen where, the strategists, because they're busy people too, and they're being pulled in a zillion different directions. We're all busy. And they're like, look, I just haven't had a lot of time to work on this brief, but here's kind of where my brain is at. I've got a halfway formed creative brief. And you're working with them to kind of go, okay, you know what? Thank you for your candor. We're going to end up like trying to rephrase the brief in our own language because we have to. That's part of the process. And they're going to go, yeah, okay. But then when you show them that first round of work and it's been a couple of days or weeks and the strategist goes, that's reminding me of something I forgot to tell you. And then you go back and forth and all of a sudden you have a better idea. So the brief, another facet of a brief is that it is meant to be transitory. It's meant to be disposable. It's meant to be changed.
I think that's a great third thing. I think reason why briefs aren't as good as they should be is if the brief writer and the creatives who receive the brief don't have a good rapport.
Yeah.
If they're isolated, like just I'm a strategist, I'm over here, they're over there. If you don't have a good rapport with these other human beings that you're supposed to be working with, it's going to be hard to come up with a document that they feel fulfilled in receiving and feel empowered to do work around.
It's like a composer writes a piece of music and goes, well, that's it, I'm done. And it never is performed.
Right.
No, you want the interpretation of the musician playing the composition,
but you also want to hear the musicians tell you like, oh yeah, like you, and that's the point about the rapport. Like every time I've joined a new agency, I'm at my 6th agency in 26 years, but every time I join a new agency, a big part of the number one thing that I need to do as a strategist is win over the confidence and the friendship of the creatives.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them, frankly, have been exposed to bad strategists or no strategist, or they don't know, they think that I'm an extension of the account department.
Right.
And I have to like weasel my way in there and say, no, you don't understand. I'm here for you. I'm here to help you. And we have shared goals. And so that's always been my way of looking at it. I don't know necessarily that a ton of other strategists see it that way, particularly the kids that come out of like a program where they were taught supposedly to be strategists, but
Right.
they've never worked in another department in the agency. That I had the benefit of growing up at a small agency, where I wore a lot of hats, and I saw, so before I became a strategist, so I kind of know how the sausage is
Right.
made, and I
Yeah.
think that that helps a lot.
Oh yeah. You have to know how the sausage is made and how other people, what is the value of an account person? What is the value of a producer? What is the value of agency leadership? And where do I fit into that? Because let's be honest, a creative brief is also a political document,
Absolutely.
and how it's presented and who presents it and who writes it. And if the account folks think, well, this is a contract that I need to protect and it's meant for the clients, politically, that's going to create a really weird environment that's going to threaten the ability. And then creative teams come up with something and you have people being very literal, like, well, the idea that you shared isn't literally in our creative brief. Well, in my worldview, that's not how they work. But I've been in circumstances where you've had account people looking at, like, holding up the brief like it's supposed to be a reflection of the work, not an instigation of the work. And so, Howard, please get out there to all the agencies and coach them, because
I'll tell you what, my audience is not agencies. They're not interested in my training. I work with marketers.
yeah. But
They're the
I also
ones.
feel like marketers would benefit in terms of, I've seen that on the client side too. In my last 6 years have been client side, and there's definitely a sense of mystery, confusion, concern,
Oh yeah.
aspiration towards, well, the agency's doing a creative brief. And it's funny, when I was at Land O'Lakes, I had a couple of instances where a marketer would say, hey, you used to work at an agency. I'm like, yeah, I was a writer. Could you look at this creative brief that they wrote? I don't understand it. Like, sure, like, happy to help. But
Yeah.
and I'm always like, they sent it to you, did they?
Yeah. Are you familiar with the work of Matt Davies and Peter Pond Von Wheeler, the Better Brief guys?
No, I'm not.
I would look it up, betterbriefs.com. They did a global survey, global kind of is an interesting definition, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the UK.
Okay.
And they asked
The
marketers.
Anglosphere.
Yeah, the Anglosphere. So they interviewed marketers from major corporations, and they interviewed agencies. And among the questions they asked were, they asked the marketers, how well would you say your creative briefs are? Would you say they're clear and inspiring? And 70 to 80% of marketers said, oh yeah, our briefs are great. About 7 to 10% of agencies agreed. So there was this Grand Canyon gap of perception. Yeah. A lot of the marketers admitted, 60 some odd percent admitted that they use the creative process to figure out the strategy.
Oh yeah. That's in Truth, Lies, and Advertising, right?
Yeah.
In that classic
John Steele.
the seminal John Steele book, right? There is, and I'm paraphrasing, but there are instances where the client and the strategist, or for whatever reason, we can't figure out the strategy, and so the brief is, creative people, please come up with something magical. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's wrong. I feel like if, for instance, the powers that be can't get their heads agreed on something, well, then tell the creative people, we can't agree it's peanut butter or chocolate, right? We can't agree it's whatever. Like, I think candor in that sort of circumstance is a good thing, because really what you're hoping for is a creative person whose job it is to combine weird things and to look at things from unusual perspectives, to kind of take that information and go, okay, you gave us some.
If your name was Bill Bernbach, you could get away with that. Back in the day, it was the creative department whose responsibility it was to come up with that kind of strategy.
Yeah.
Now the creative and the strategy have been separated. Just a couple of days ago, Henry and I had a great conversation with Professor Mark Ritson.
Yeah.
And he had some interesting things to say about what happens in the marketing world, where they take simple ideas about what marketing is and then mess it up with gobbledygook.
Yeah.
So that people forget what the basic fundamentals of marketing are, including how do you come up with the positioning, including how do you figure out strategy.
Right.
What Peter, Paul, and Matt did was codify, was basically say, we have research now to demonstrate what John Steele was saying so many years ago about what clients do. And so we don't know what the strategy is. So let's just kind of send the creatives off, do their thing, and we'll figure it out as we go along.
The bureaucracy of large clients is also a huge enemy of creativity, because, and Howard and I have talked about, you have a client brief written by some mid-level marketing person who gives it to the agency. The agency does its best job. They write their creative brief. They come back and they present the work, and now the work is going to be presented all the way up the ladder to people that have no idea what was in that original brief that their own company gave to the agency. And so they're like, why are we doing this again? Why is this like this? And so there was all these agreements. The ultimate approver of the work never approved even the client's own brief to the agency.
So I'll give you a classic example. I'm working at Arnold Worldwide. We have the Goodyear business. We had worked on the Dunlop tire business, and then we acquired the Goodyear business from Goodby, which I think had something about on the wings of Goodyear or something was their campaign. Anyway, so we're working on Goodyear, right? And we're doing research and all this stuff, and what we're hearing from the client, this took place over the course of a year. We're going to change the logo, the famous Goodyear logo that's on buildings all over the world, on product. We're going to change that. Wow. So we bring in, an external design firm, very expensive design firm, and we go through that whole process. And we have briefs, and we develop campaigns, and we do rip-o-matics, and we're testing things, for this whole new positioning launch. We go to Akron, Ohio. We walk into the building is like 150 years old. You get up to the floor, the executive floor, which hasn't changed since 1940. Beautiful wood paneling, carved things. It literally says executive row carved in gold letters as you walk through. And we're going to see the global president and CEO of Goodyear Tire Holdings. So he's the global guy. And then there's, the CEO and president of North America. And then there's the like the Russian nesting dolls of hierarchy, right? And we go, and there's an anteroom with the woman who is his first secretary. There's an anteroom with the executive secretary, and again, like beautiful desks, and like someone's pointing out that the oak panels,
like corporate royalty,
came from France, and you're like, in the secretary's room, and then you finally get into the room with this individual who, you're like, why are you meeting with us? You should be meeting with the king of Burundi or something, right? But okay. And so we present, and there's the Russian nesting dolls. There was like 20 people on the client side as we're presenting, and the rationale, and it makes a lot of sense about like why we're doing what we're doing, what we're presenting, that the rationale, the whole background or something like that. And you can tell fairly quickly that the top guy has no idea. He has not been briefed at all about why we're here and what we're doing. Which is
much less an agreement, right?
Yeah, I saw this coming. I just saw this coming.
It's one thing not to know. It's another thing to something that he's probably gonna just like balk at.
So it of course blows up, and this guy's like and I'll tell you why in a second. But basically he doesn't want to do any of it. And the best line is he looks at, so my boss, the creative director, is presenting the bulk of the work, and is a wonderful presenter, really sharp guy. And this global CEO president points at Alan and says, look, very dismissively, I could get 100 people in here tomorrow who could do better work than you. To which my boss stands up and goes, I'd like to see you try. And like, come on. And like, I'm like, I guess we're leaving. And the account guy's like, yeah, I guess we're leaving. Because we knew we had an ironclad contract that said, if we quit or you fire us, you owe us for like 9 months. It's ironclad. So we're walking out knowing we have 9 months of money coming to us on this thing. And now the CEO guy's kind of like, just had a pissing match with someone, and that's kind of fun, whatever. He doesn't care. The rest of the Russian nesting dolls are in panic because they know like, wait, a year's worth of work is now down the tubes. We owe this agency for another 9 months and nothing's going to happen. Like, like just massive stuff. The reason the guy actually laid into us about the work had nothing to do with the work, had nothing to do with the strategy. Turns out he hadn't been given the chance to approve hiring us. So the head of North America had taken the business from Goodby and handed it to us, but apparently hadn't asked Dad if that was okay. So the whole thing was a stunt for business politics. It's fabulous, right?
Yeah.
And
it's like an episode out of Mad Men.
Or Secession or whatever, right? It was classic. But yeah, and I look at scenarios like that and go, well, the briefing is it's really political, right? You want to kind of find out, what are we doing here, and does everybody agree with what we're doing?
Well, there's a reverse version of that is something that I've encountered in my training too many times to count, where I will travel back before the pandemic. I would travel to a major brand of fast food. You'd all recognize the name. I'm not going to say it. And I would say, okay, well, one of two things would happen. What's your tagline? So we don't have one. And Henry and I have talked about this before. It's like an opportunity to really define or explain the brand has been left on the table.
Right.
The other thing that happened, and of course, how do you write a brief if you don't even have a tagline? Shouldn't you try to create one? It would certainly help you understand your brand. The other thing that I encounter a lot is I'll ask the people in the room, the mid-level marketers, okay, what is your, and we can debate whether the phrase I'm going to use is legitimate or not, but I will ask them, what's the promise of your brand? What is your brand promise?
Right.
And there's a debate whether that's even a right way to say it, but that's what I use. What is your brand promise? And I get a lot of people saying, they haven't told us yet upstairs. They haven't told us yet. They're still figuring it out. So these are all Henry asked a great question at the top of our discussion. What are some examples of why a brief goes bad?
That's one of them.
You've listed, we've talked about 3 that are really good, outstanding examples. That's a 4th or maybe a 5th.
Yeah, if the brand house, it's like architecture or running an orchestra or any endeavor. If we don't know why we're all here, if the purpose of the company, the promise of the company or whatever isn't articulated, it's really hard to write an effective creative brief.
Yeah. And to Ritzen's point is, doesn't have to be a 100-slide deck.
Correct.
It should be, we want to represent these 3 things to consumers.
Yes.
3 words, 3 short phrases of what we're value, we're this, we're that. Yeah. We're premium, we're this, we're that. It doesn't have to be, but they have all of these, the brand pyramid, the brand circle, the
house
circles, the house, and it's too much, it's too complicated. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I tend to look at those things to just say, and this is what like Luke Sullivan would say too. It's like, is it simple enough that you can grasp it, right? And I think Ritson says the same thing. It's like, if you're creating complexity just to create complexity, stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'd rather have the 3 words that everybody in the company knows.
Right.
Exactly.
And they know this is what we're trying to do.
Right.
And forget about everything else. If you execute on those 3 things, you're doing great.
Yeah. Amen.
So Tim, let me just back up a sec here.
Yeah.
When I got into this whole creative brief business, I can tell you exactly when the straw broke the camel's back. I know exactly when it happened. So that's the premise of my question. I was a creative director in Minneapolis at Carlson Marketing Group, and I was working on the British Airways account. It was all their loyalty programs.
Right.
So I had a staff of creatives and account people in Minneapolis, and there was account people in New York to be close to the client because they were JFK.
Yeah.
And I wasn't on the job for very long, 6 months, 7 months. We would get a Marcom brief from the client, and then we would respond with our brief. Well, I noticed one day that the Marcom brief and our creative brief were identical word for word. There was no change. It was just cut and paste. And I said, okay, just like, this is enough. I went to my bosses And I kid you not, before I got the question out of my mouth, can I take my group through a creative brief training, which I didn't even have at the time. I just,
Right.
I
Right.
come up with something, but it's like, can I take them through some, and before I got the words out of my mouth, my boss said, yes, please, please. Because they all knew that there was a problem.
Yeah.
That's when I started. I wrote a little tutorial, and then that became I turned that into a full day workshop, and that became a blog, then that became the book.
Yeah.
And now the rest is history. So my question to you is, when well, it's usually my cat who does that, so it's nice to have a little bit of a change. Was there a straw that broke the camel's back for you and you said, I've got to sit down and now I got to write something about why the brief has got to be treated with more respect, what we can do to write a better brief? Can you think about that? Did you have a moment?
I think it was a sequence of, just you keep receiving briefs that are suboptimal, uninspired, kind of just fill in the blank exercises. And we were talking earlier, so for me, blogging was this thing that I got into in 2007, 2008. And what am I going to write about? Early blogging was like, well, I'm going to write about the world around me. I'm going to write about what's happening in culture, what's happening in advertising. Oh, I'm going to kind of complain about the fact that most of the briefs I receive are crap. And, maybe Seth Godin had said something or someone else had said something that seemed relevant to that point. And so, I think it was just a culmination of, well, this is this moment, this document, and I had read Truth, Lies, and Advertising had come out. And so it was a subject. And it's like, well, I'm the recipient of the subject, and I want something to write about. So I'm going to write about creative briefs. So I think that it wasn't one particular moment. It was just more a kind of a culmination of having received some not great briefs, and then having the opportunity through blogging and having the desire and kind of going, I'm going to write about this stuff. And and then more recently, this is the thing about me and blogging. I write to excise thoughts that are in my head. And once they're out excised, I literally don't care. People can't leave comments and I'm kind of like, oh, I suppose I should engage. But I wrote to get it out of my brain. Mm-hmm. That's it. Just get it out of my brain. Otherwise, it's going to keep nagging, And so the more recent writing about briefs was the result of, being in an experience where there was a brief that it was such a lost opportunity, knowing what when you see a brief where you're like, really? Wow. I'm just like, there's so many great books out there that people could just, for the lack of reading, what is it, 94, 95 pages, you could do a pretty good job, right? So there's plenty of great instruction material out there, and there's Google. So if you wanted to know how to write a great creative brief,
there's the Brief Brothers. They could,
the Brief Brothers can help you out, right? All of that stuff is out there. So, when you confronted with one, you're like, oh, come on, really? And I also felt like, from the perspective of the recipient, was just an area that, obviously I hadn't done enough internet research to discover you guys and things like that, but to kind of put that out there and advance that point of view. We write creative briefs for an audience, and that audience are creative people with the expectation that they're going to take the document and create something magical as a result.
Yeah. And
the sad truth is, so many briefs are themselves uninspired and uninformative.
The reason that I brought Howard to the agency, after reading his book, was I was a strategist. We had a small strategy department in the agency, but on a lot of cases, if it were smaller assignments and kind of day-to-day work, the job of writing the brief would fall to an account person, usually a junior person.
Right.
So I thought, this is a way of me as the head of strategy elevating a little bit of the quality of the briefs that are written by non-strategist personnel.
Yeah.
And which brings me to the, I think, and I'm humble enough to know that you don't have to be a strategist to write a good brief. You just have to want to write a good brief and set your mind to it and practice it.
Agreed.
There's account people that are brilliant people, very thoughtful, and they can write a great brief.
Yeah.
The problem is they don't put, in a lot of cases, in a lot of agencies, there's not a lot of emphasis put in the account teams about writing good briefs.
Mhm.
And so what I said is, I'm the head of the strategy department in my agency, and I'm a working strategist as well. I might write half a dozen briefs in a year, which isn't a lot. There's, how many working days do you have in a year? And I'm writing maybe half a dozen briefs. It's not a lot of time that I spend actually writing a brief. But
you're reacting to other people's briefs and coaching.
But the more importantly, when I'm doing research, I'm thinking about the brief.
Yes.
When I'm listening to the client talk about their product, I'm thinking about the brief. Like, all of that is input that I have my antennas up, because at some point it's going to come to play in my contemplation of the brief. Like, I'm not writing a brief right now, but I'm looking at this competitive presentation, and all that is coming in as it. And if you're not in that mindset as a brief writer, you're not doing that. All that information is just passing you by and escaping you, which I think is the advantage that a strategist, like a dedicated strategist, has over maybe like a junior account person who's, oh, now it's time to write a brief. Now I got to turn the brief writing hat on, put it on, which is different than, like, I'm always just thinking about, like, how's this going to affect strategy?
Right. So you brought up something interesting, which is, as a strategist or as an account person, you always have your antenna out, and in hopes of, ooh, there's a nugget, there's an insight, there's something that can fuel a great insight, fuel a great brief. And especially today, given the speed of TikTok and other platforms where, hey, some really interesting, salient thing is occurring on a specific platform that could benefit our brand, right? But we need to act right now, like in 45 minutes, like before 24 hours, right? In order to capture the zeitgeist and benefit. And so there's a situation happening today, which didn't occur, even 10 years ago, around briefing, kind of live briefing, like 24-hour a day, like live in the moment briefing, which is sort of it's a willingness as a team, whether you're account people or strategists or someone, to notice that there's a moment, something's happening in culture. It's relevant to what we do as a brand, right? It's not just us saying something, there's some salience there, right? But then having process and people and familiarity that says, hey, this cool thing happened. It's relevant to us because of X, Y, and Z. Now let's go react to it or remix it or play with it. And I think that's actually helping briefing, just the general nature of briefing, that the speed of culture is helping client and legal teams, because they're also used to, like, well, it's going to take 3 weeks for legal to, like, look at and approve and put our balls on the brief. Like, don't you love it? You get a creative brief that's been, like, got the correct TMs and R balls. You're like, no one cares. I remember storyboards where, like, in the like the description copy on a storyboard, make sure the R balls, like, it's a whatever. But the fact that we're moving faster, I think, is helping the practice of briefing, because when you're moving fast, we don't have time for like 18 bullet points. We have time for 3 words.
Well,
from your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that, with a humongous caveat. Things are speeding up, but the thing we are lacking is the time to think.
Yeah. Oh, agreed.
And I've got a blog post coming out tomorrow that basically it asks the question, what is the creative brief writer's worst enemy? And I'll give you a sneak peek. It's not even the internet. It's the phone.
Yeah.
Because the phone facilitates access to all this.
Yeah.
One of the most famous briefs ever written is 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Yeah.
I would rewrite that to say it's 1,000 addictions in your pocket.
Right.
And we don't take the time to think, because, as Henry was alluding to before, and we've talked about many times, the document is not a form. It is a thinking document.
Yes.
It's a thinking document. It requires you to, the answers aren't just automatic, like filling out an application for a job, or a driver's license. You've got to
Yeah.
think about the answers.
That thing about the phone is interesting too, because we've also talked about like the internet's a wonderful thing. You can get a lot of data, learn a lot of things,
Mhm.
right? But unfortunately, it's become a substitute for basic homework, right? Like
Yep.
I give
Yeah.
this story about I briefed creatives at the Miami Ad School. They have a program called Heroes and Sidekicks, and what it is that you go on a Friday and you address the students at the ad school. You give them a speech, and you submit via email a brief to the creatives, and then like the following Tuesday you're going to see the work that they developed based on the brief that you wrote. So I wrote a brief for Advanced Auto Parts, which is an auto parts
Yep.
store that we have, and it's kind of like the second tier auto parts place. Like there's AutoZone's really nice, and then there's Advanced, and but I looked it up on Google Maps, and there were two within walking distance of the ad school of Advanced. So when I was reviewing the work, I asked at the beginning, I said, how many of you guys went to Advanced Auto Parts? And like one creative team raised their hands. And I said, guys, this is a lesson to all of you. You had within walk, it wasn't even that if you needed to drive somewhere, you walk through the store, see what they had, talk to the manager, talk to the customers. I said, you would have come away with a wealth of information. And of course, the team that went and did it was a lot more thoughtful. Their work was more on point. They were, and I think that the internet is kind of like a crutch that we're using to not get out there and talk to consumers. Go to the fucking grocery store and ask them, why do you buy that brand of paper towel?
Amen. I'm with you 100%.
Yeah. So Tim, we'll wrap things up here.
Sure.
It's been an amazing conversation. I think we should rename this show, Henry, the Brief Moaners. We've been ranting and raving about our problems with briefs for like the whole hour. It's been great. Fellow travelers, we haven't really just focused on the brief in a long time. What's your sense? You said that you thought that the speed of the world is going to benefit writing briefs. What is your sense? Is there anything else that you see? Are you optimistic? What was your sense about the future of brief writing?
Well, I'm cursed with optimism, and it's this. I look at. So first off, I do think about briefs in the context of advertising agencies and design firms and social media firms and just marketing. But the brief also exists in architecture. It exists in like government policy. It exists, in a bunch of different forms. It may not be called a creative brief per se, but that document that again kind of marks a moment in time as we're going to transition into creating something, right? Whether that's a policy or, an educational program or an ad campaign. So the good news is that briefs aren't going away. They're going to continue, and that I think that as people recognize their importance, the smart marketers, the smart agencies are the ones who invest. If I'm a marketer and I need a campaign, it's like I honestly, if I was a marketer today and I went to the agency and I'd say, let's talk about what I think as a marketer that we need to do with the campaign. You're going to write your own brief. And I recognize that brief is it's internal for you. You're going to need to use your own language because you're talking to your own people. And the goal is come back with a world-changing campaign. So I honestly, in a way, as a marketer, I don't really care what language you use or what you put into the document, so long as great work results, right? And I think that we can agree strategically up front about like what the parameters are, right? So I hope that more marketers learn what a brief could do for them, and then instruct and inspire their agencies to treat it with that level of respect, to say whether they want to see the brief or not. Like I'll agree. Marketers should see creative briefs, if only to know what great ones look like, right?
Yeah.
And to recognize what they should be, but also to recognize that like it wasn't written for you because you're not going to do anything with it, like other than approve it. but that doesn't lead to like ads on air, right? So recognizing that it's really meant for someone else to go do something. I think learning that, and then when you start to see great work, you're like, I don't really care how the sausage is made, but I'm glad that this work is great. So keep doing great briefs. So I'm optimistic that as podcasts like this occur, as more people talk about it, more agencies recognize, okay, we can't just put the lowest, youngest, newest person on the briefing thing. We need to have the smartest, most mature person putting these briefs together. We need to recognize that a great brief can fundamentally change the orbit, the trajectory of this agency, not just the client, not just the creative team, right? It could, the great briefs are the ones that cause the Widens and the whatever to rocket into, wherever they are.
The other interesting observation, and Howard's probably tired of me talking about Ken, but we just won the agencies that I work at is 50 years old, and we just won our first lion ever at Ken.
Congrats.
And thanks. I've been toiling in this industry for 26 years, and I had never won one before. Yeah. And I'm looking back at the brief that I wrote for the assignment, and it was not what I thought was going to be the linchpin of that brief ended up being something different to what I thought, which is also, I think, a lesson, which is, you never know what part of the brief is going to be the important part of the brief. Yep. Every part of the brief should be well-fashioned and well-crafted, but you don't know where the spark is going to come from. In this case, it happened to be, I had found an interview with the client where he talked all about what he thought was great advertising. And I cut it up into little pieces and I put it in the briefing deck. And I said, look, he says that he wants this. And so that was more instructive and helped more than anything I had written as a single-minded proposition or a target description.
Right. Hey, whatever word, it's that great joke about the Wendy's where's the beef stuff, that line, where's the beef? That wasn't the money line, right? There was an earlier line in the dialogue that they all thought was going to be the big money laugh. And, so you write the brief, you don't know what will trigger someone. And that's kind of the magic of it. I guess if there's a takeaway, it's to recognize that a creative brief is kind of a magical document. If you're willing to believe that.
Can be, I would say.
Yeah. It can be. If you're willing to believe that, and if you're willing to nurture that and bring that kind of energy into the process and to encourage it with the people that are involved, you're going to be pleasantly surprised with what results.
I think that's a great way to end, Tim. It's a magical document if you believe it can be. So Tim Brunelle, I mean, copywriter, creative director, agency head, strategist, creative brief thinker, et cetera, and an amazing guest. We really loved having you on the Brief Brothers. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Henry. And I'll go pick up the new book and advocate on your behalf, because I love that, to discover that you're out there doing this, because this is how things get better, is you guys talking about it and sharing your wisdom and encouraging other people to share theirs.
Thanks for being on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Fun.
All right. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye-bye.